All righty. Seeing that we are 2 minutes after the hour here now, I will go ahead and get us started. So I'd like to welcome everyone here to Touro University, which we would normally be out on beautiful Mare Island out in Vallejo. Before we begin the formal part of today's session, I'd like to acknowledge that Touro University, California sits on the unceded land that was part of the 1851-1852 unratified treaties. Specifically, Touro is located in Track 296, which is part of Treaty O. This land is the traditional home of the Karkan people, one of the 8 Ohlone tribes located in the Bay Area. Solano County was also the traditional home of various tribes of the Patwan and Miwok. Consistent with the university's commitment to diversity and inclusion, Touro is working towards building relationships with Indigenous communities through academic pursuits, partnerships, historical recognitions, community service, and enrollment efforts. So today, I'd like to, I guess that brings us to, and let me stop sharing here, our, I guess, main event. And we have Dr. Tom Snyder with us today. And Dr. Snyder is a retired urologist and Navy officer. In retirement, he's combined his naval and medical interests to work on a history of the Navy's first West Coast hospital, which was located on Mare Island. He's the founding executive director of the Society for the History of Naval Medicine, which sponsors academic panels, offers graduate student travel and research grants, and awards a biennial Harold D. Langley Book Prize for excellence in the history of maritime medicine. Tom is a companion in the Naval Order of the United States, America's oldest naval history organization. And at Albany Medical College, Tom founded and coordinates the Albany Base Hospital Number 33 Society, which is an alumni military affinity group. At home in Vallejo, he frequently lectures to local groups, and we're very happy about that, on the history of maritime and military medicine. He also writes a blog called Of Ships and Surgeons, notes on maritime medicine, past and present. And he's published several articles on maritime medical history. And with that, I will introduce you to Tom and turn it over to you, sir.
Michael Barber, thank you very much for that introduction. I really appreciate it. I also appreciate Provost Schweitzer's offer to let me give this talk from time to time at Touro University. I like to do this for the students here, just to give them an understanding of the history of the place. I refer to the grounds on Mare Island Naval Hospital as hallowed territory. And I like them to know the story behind this. So I'm about to share here. Here we go. So first a little history. If I can advance my slides, let's see now. There we go. Okay. So some background. The Pacific Squadron, the United States government established a squadron of ships in the Pacific in 1821. Now, this was well before California statehood, of course. So the ships were home ported in Chile and in Peru. And they ranged, as the arrows show, up through the North Pacific, out to the Hawaiian Islands, and even beyond. There were several reasons for this. The ships represented the American government in the Pacific, where the British, the Royal Navy, was still the naval hegemon of the world. And the Royal Navy were not at all adverse to stopping American ships and identifying possible subjects of the Crown and taking them off the ships, pressing them into service in the Royal Navy. In addition, the Brits were interested in the Sandwich Islands, as we were, and we felt we should have some naval presence there to counter the British influence. And also, there was still controversy about where the border should be between Canada and America. And so we wanted to have a naval presence there. Now, so when California becomes a state, We wanted to have an anchorage in North America rather than home porting our ships in Southern California. And the story goes like this. Gold was discovered in 1848. 2 years later, California was voted into statehood. That's an amazingly rapid process, I think, and I think that gold probably motivated that. In the meanwhile, the Navy, being interested in an anchorage in California, sent commissions of officers out to decide a location. Interestingly enough, the Navy never sent people to Southern California. They only looked in the San Francisco Bay Area. And in 1852, the commission led by Commodore Sloat chose Mare Island. Now, at the time, Mare Island was owned by, or nominally was occupied by some just people hanging out. The Navy had to negotiate a purchase of the island. And once that was accomplished, the Navy sent Commander Farragut. You will recognize Farragut as the Navy's first admiral, but that happened later. He came out here as a commander. Clearly a rising star in the Navy to be sent out to found the first naval base on the West Coast. With him, he brought this chart. And the blue circle actually shows a 400 square foot space identified as Naval Hospital. So it's clear that the Navy intended on having a naval hospital right from the get-go. 2 days after Farragut arrived on Mare Island, he brought the Sloop of War Warren over from Sausalito. And this ship's sickbay became the first medical facility at Mare Island. I like this drawing. It's in a book called Naval Sketches of the War in California. It was drawn by gunner William H. Myers, then aboard the Sloop of War Dale, a sister ship to this. This is the only image of the Sloop of War Warren I could find. Typically, the Navy has had images of every commissioned ship, but I could never find one of the Sloop of War Warren. In this case, you'll see, does my pointer show up on your screens? You'll see these small boats out here. This ship has been captured by pirates, and the Sloop of War Warren is doing a cutting out expedition. These men in these boats will get aboard this ship and steal it back from the pirates and return it to its rightful owner. Aboard the Warren was John Mills Brown, who had graduated from Harvard, the medical department of Harvard in 1852, joined the Navy as an assistant surgeon the next year, and his first duty was aboard Warren. Now, clearly, he didn't look like this when he was aboard Warren. He was a younger man. This is an image of him that's hanging in a fraternal hall in Vallejo, where he was the grand master of the fraternal hall for a while as an older gentleman. He was an interesting fellow. He actually went on to become a surgeon general in the Navy, and when he died, his obituary said he was unusual for a physician. He had a gift to gab. Now, the hospital space was busy. The surgeon would hold sick call on board, and patients who required care would be berthed in the ship. An idea of the workload can be seen here, but what I like best is this bottom line. The daily average cost per man to take care of patients in 1856 or 1860 was 3 cents, 8 mills, and a tenth. They actually reckoned it to the tenth of a cent. Real economic healthcare. Now, that ship, the Warren, was too small, it was uncomfortable, and it was replaced a few years later by the USS Independence, a larger ship, but still uncomfortable. One of the things I liked about the historical research was all of the material, all of the narrative for this history is really contained in the correspondence between the hospital commanders, the naval people on Mare Island, and the Navy's Bureau of Medicine and Surgery in Washington, D.C. All handwritten back in those days, and oftentimes difficult to read, but they wrote beautifully. And I particularly like these statements. So this is Surgeon William Bishop writing in 1863 that this ship, particularly in the winter season, is a very unsuitable place to treat the sick. It is cold, wet, and open to every wind that blows. And any of you who have ever been on the waterfront on Mare Island understands what a cold wind, even when the temperature is 65, can be. Surgeon Harlan of the USS Saranac wrote in part, "A better place is needed for the patients than a ship off San Francisco, where gusts of cold wind make every invalid shudder." Can you imagine the folks back in Washington, D.C. reading this and saying, gosh, maybe we need to help get a new hospital for those guys out there? Well, there was something else going on in the East in the early 1860s, namely the Civil War. And I think that the government back there was too busy prosecuting the Civil War to pay much attention to this small Navy base on the West Coast. So the locals took things into their own hands, and they converted an unused granary, a storage place for wheat and oats and all that kind of stuff. They converted it to hospital use. And it was a very nominal cost. It was a couple $1,000s, probably, something like that. And as Surgeon Bishop said, it has accommodation for 20 beds in an emergency. By using the chapel, they could put up 30 to take care of patients. This became the first hospital structure on Mare Island. Now, the correspondence would go back sometimes with a heading on the letter saying U.S. Naval Hospital, Mare Island. The Bureau would typically write back saying, you can't say that you're not a real hospital, call yourself a clinic. Nevertheless, it played the role of a hospital. And this brings up the story of Platon Vallejo, MD. Now, you may remember that the last Mexican government of California was Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo. Platon, that's Plato in Spanish, was one of his sons. And Platon was the first Californio, that is to say, Hispanic of California origin, to attend an American medical college. That was Columbia PNS in New York. Now, I imagine that before that, the locals probably went to Spanish or South American medical schools, but Platon went to Columbia, where local rumor had it he graduated number 2 in his class. Well, I contacted the Alumni Association of Columbia, and they said, well, no, that's not possible because we didn't have a grade system then. It was a pass-fail system. But what we can tell you is that Platon Vallejo's graduating thesis on the secretions of the kidneys won second prize that year. In any case, Platon came back to California. First he joined the Army, and this was during the Civil War, served in the Civil War, came back to California and served in aboard ship in the Pacific Mail Packet Company. It was a transport firm that actually was taking California gold south to the Panama Isthmus, where it could be transported across Panama and then up the East Coast to Washington to help fund the war. After a few years of this, he settled into practice in Vallejo and actually had a distinguished practice, retiring in his mid-80s. His prescription book is still in our local museum. In any case, the connection with the Naval Hospital is this. I came across a letter of report going from the hospital back to DC saying, describing a patient who'd been shot in the rump during an anti-piratical action off the Mexican coast. The ball had lodged in his hip. He was infected, he was losing weight, he was clearly not going to survive unless some intervention was done. Now, of course, they didn't have x-rays, but they knew that he had a fractured hip. Well, it turns out that they offered him to remove the hip joint, and they described it to the patient, the risks and the benefits of surgery, and he cheerfully accepted. And the surgery was performed under nitrous oxide anesthesia. 8 surgical gentlemen, in quotes, were present, including Platon Vallejo. So Platon Vallejo helped that man. That man survived and actually flourished and walked out of the hospital with the help of a sort of exoskeleton outfit that supported his leg several months later. Well, finally, in 1869, the Surgeon General of the Navy at the time contacted John MacArthur, a Philadelphia architect, to draw plans for a hospital for Mare Island. And this is the front page of John MacArthur's architectural drawing. Now, it's clear that MacArthur never stepped foot in California, at least for 2 reasons. One, this building is entirely masonry. And number 2 is the water supply was going to be water collected from the roof and during rains and routed into 2 cisterns in front of the hospital. I'll talk more about this later. Surgeon Brown, whom we've already met, and civil engineer by the name of Brown were appointed as supervisors of construction. Bids were let, ultimately 7 bidders, and the winner was Dennis Jordan of San Francisco at $148,000, 20% lower than the next highest bidder, competitor because he had a secret plan. And his secret plan was this: he walked the grounds of Mare Island, and he realized that the soil that was going to be dug out to form the cellar of the hospital was excellent clay that could be burned into bricks. And so he actually constructed 2 kilns and created his own bricks, which were and are today considered to be very excellent quality bricks. More about that a little later. In any case, Surgeon Brown and Civil Engineer Brown, having seen chimneys, masonry chimneys in California during earthquakes, realized that a masonry building was not an ideal form of construction. They recommended to the Bureau that iron supports should be put in the vertical structures and iron straps wrapped around the structure to help support it in the event of earthquakes. They cited the cost down to the penny, and it was approved by the Bureau. So the building was reinforced against earthquakes. A good thing, too, as we'll see in a minute. This is the image of the hospital, described as palatial at the time, and I think it is. I think it's a lovely building. Off in the distance, you can see a floating dry dock that actually had been brought across the isthmus and up the coast and set up actually before the shipyard was officially open. And that was the basis of the activity of the naval yard. Now, there's another feature that I want to point out. You see this windmill right here, and you see this building right here with a pipe going up. Well, clearly rained. It doesn't rain in California from about April until about November. So they ran out of water the first year. So the first thing they do is they put down a well in this ravine beside the hospital. And it turns out the water was brackish. So they built a still to create distilled water, but that water ran out. But incidentally, this building also had an apparatus that converted coal into gas. And this is actually a gas line that goes up, and they had installed gas lighting in the hospital. So, but as for water, what they did for water from then on was they actually went out with boats and drew water from nearby creeks and brought it back for the hospital. Finally, pipes were brought from Vallejo, from the Vallejo municipal supply, but that ran out on occasions. And really, there was a continual problem with water until about 1898, when pipes brought water from Green Valley, which is about 15 or 18 miles down the road. After that, I never saw another complaint about water really until World War II. Now, this is another thing I like about historical research. So there's a question: was this a naval hospital? When did the naval hospital open? This is letter number 2 from U.S. Naval Hospital, Mare Island, California, dated 1st February 1871. Very short. It says, "Sir, I have the honor to report this institution ready for the reception of patients. I am very respectfully your obedient surgeon, John Brown, surgeon in charge." And that's sent to Dr. Wood, who was the chief of the Bureau of Medicine and Surgery. The man that had his hip removed actually walked out of this hospital, not from that converted granary. Now, so 1871 until the end of the century was an active century. It was a part of a time where a huge amount of technological change was occurring. I suppose you could say it was similar to what we're experiencing now. You had candles for lighting, then gas, and finally electricity for lighting. You had telephones for internal and external communication. Originally, for instance, in the hospital was built with voice tubes that ran from the various floors down to throughout the hospital. And if you needed, for instance, to turn up the heat, you would yell into the voice tube that went down to the cellar to the heating system and say, "We need more heat." Naval construction, voice tubes were common in ships back in the day. And actually in naval construction, voice tubes really didn't go away in construction until the 1950s. But finally, they were able to install telephones. In fact, telephone down on the waterfront was very convenient, because if a worker got injured and needed medical assistance, originally you would have to send a guy on a horse a mile up to the hospital and say, "Come on down with the wagon, we've got a guy that's hurt." But now you could pick up the telephone. And actually there are records of calls back to the East Coast in the 1870s, I think. I already mentioned a reliable water supply. And the final thing was a purpose-built operating room. Now, originally, the operating room in the hospital was a conference room. They would simply clear off the oaken table, break out the instruments, wait for sunrise. You couldn't use gas lighting with ether anesthetic, which is explosive and flammable. You waited for sunrise, and then you would do your surgery. Finally, in the early 1890s, the Navy actually came out with a letter to all naval hospitals saying, we need to do scientific surgery here. You need to create an operating room, and here's how you do it. And they were very specific with the instructions. This was kind of unusual at the time. Most of the time, there was very little direction coming from Washington, D.C., unless the local authorities had a question. Then they could write back to the Bureau saying, well, we're contemplating this, or we need advice on this, and Washington would answer. This was one of the first, what I would say, top-down instructions that came from the Bureau. So when the operating room was done, it had a fireproof lighting, so you had an operating light that you could operate 24/7, a specifically designed sterilizer. They even described what paint should be used on the bulkheads and the overhead, and what tile should be used on the deck of the operating room. The result was, a couple of days after this thing opened, there was a letter from the hospital that went back to the Bureau saying, last night, we performed an emergency appendectomy after dark to the great satisfaction to all concerned. Commanding officers' quarters. Now, this was built in 1892. The hospital, remember, opened in 1871. So where did the hospital commander live for that 20 years? He lived in the hospital. He lived on the first deck of the Naval Hospital. Now, this was considered somewhat gauche because the commander's family, his wife and his children, would be put in a position of rubbing elbows with common sailors, and that wasn't well appreciated. But finally, the real reason the house got built was because they needed the space for beds. By 1892, the Pacific Fleet had grown, and the hospital was getting busier. From the time the hospital was built, every year, the commanding officer of the hospital would put as part of his request for the next fiscal year a house to be built, and the cost didn't change really for the 20 years, about $10,000. This would be duly sent to the Bureau of Medicine and Surgery. The Bureau would pass it to the Secretary of the Navy. The Secretary of the Navy would send it to Congress, and Congress would turn it down until 1891. And then in 1892, this structure, which I think is quite a lovely, I guess you would call it Victorian structure, was built out behind the hospital where the commanding officer could now be housed. 31 March 1898, the Mare Island earthquake, Richter 6.5 estimated. I was doing my research at the National Archives in DC. I saw this thing. Fortunately, I had internet connectivity, so I texted Mare Island earthquake, and lo and behold, it was a real deal. I mean, there was damage in town. Again, masonry chimneys came down, and the earthquake was centered on Mare Island. So the island was the center of the shake. The hospital was seriously damaged, but it did not fall down, and no one was injured, or no one was seriously injured. I credit the surgeon and the supervising engineers for having the steel rebar and the support of the hospital put in. It probably saved lives, but the hospital could not be used, so the patients were immediately moved to a nearby Marine barracks where they were housed until a new hospital could be constructed. Now, this is not an image that's contemporary, but it does show the naval barracks, the Marine Corps barracks that was used to hospitalize the patients. Within, just over 2 months, or just over 1 month, the earthquake was at the end of March. We passed through April, and on the 4th of May, Congress appropriated $100,000 for a reconstructed hospital. That's an amazingly rapid response from Congress, I think. And this time, DC architect William Poindexter was engaged to produce plans to include all conveniences for modern antiseptic, I think they really meant aseptic. Antiseptic was the way you pumped an antiseptic into the air while you're doing surgery, whereas aseptic surgery is where all the instruments are sterilized before you do it. And they were doing aseptic surgery at the time. Poindexter had read his architectural texts well. He realized that in earthquake country, you couldn't use masonry, so he specified redwood and Oregon fir for the structure. And so it was built. The building was built to be able to flex to survive earthquakes. And as I'll show you shortly, the building has survived several earthquakes. The other interesting thing is the legislation specified that the new structure built on the old building's foundation. Remember Dennis Brown's, the constructor's bricks? Those bricks were still there, and those bricks are still the foundation of that hospital. At one point, I found a California brick expert, and I asked him if he knew anything about Jordan's bricks. He said, "Do you know where there's some?" And I told him, and within days, he'd already visited the site, came back with pictures and analysis saying, "Yep, I'm convinced that these are, in fact, Jordan's bricks, and they are of excellent quality." And this is the hospital building that Poindexter built. I found this picture, a later commanding officer of the hospital from the early 20th century, was a photographer, an amateur photographer. He took a picture of the office. It's certainly a pretty Spartan affair. But what you can see on the bulkhead there is the list of commanding officers of the hospital. This facility stands today, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Now, I have this theory that as science became scientific, as medicine became scientific, we built structures to represent that progress. And this facility was built as we became aware of contagion and of infectious disease. This is the Contagious Hospital, built in 1903. So what contagious diseases would be kept here? Well, the obvious one is tuberculosis. I mean, we need to isolate the tuberculars. The others were the syphilitics. I could never quite figure out why you hospitalize syphilitics in a contagious hospital. Well, I guess it is a contagious disease. The junior medical officers' buildings were also built in 1903, referred to as cottages in the correspondence. Now, where did the junior medical officers live until this? They lived the same place that the commanding officer did, in the hospital. And as the need for beds increased, and now, of course, this is after we'd taken the Philippines during the Spanish-American War. We now have a real naval and Marine Corps presence in the Pacific. We need beds to take care of people coming back sick from the Pacific. These cottages still stand. One was for the executive officer, the second in command of the hospital. The other one was for the chief surgeon. These buildings still stand. They lay fallow for several years. Somebody bought them about 10 years ago, and they're now actually used as housing for Touro University students. You should see the beautiful oaken, I think oak wainscoting on their first floors. They're gorgeous. Nurses. Now, the Army had nurses at the turn of the century. During the Spanish-American War, the Army had female nurses. The Navy had wanted female nurses. In fact, it was part of the process. The Surgeon General would go to Congress and say, we'd like funding to establish a corps of nurses. And finally, in during the Spanish-American War, incidentally, there were a few women who volunteered as nurses for the Navy, including a couple of medical students, female medical students from Johns Hopkins University. They received very nice thank you notes after their service, but nothing else could be done until 1907, when the Congress finally approved legislation that would permit the establishment of a nurse corps. This is a group of the first nurses. The woman in the blue circle is Miss Martha Pringle, one of the best, if not the best, nurses in the Corps. She came to Mare Island as the first nurse. Now, she looks like a formidable woman. And I do believe that you would have to be a formidable person to come out to the frontier and be the sole nurse, the sole care provider in the nursing line. But there she is. She came. Now, she was there for several years by herself, and finally the commanding officers were writing back saying, she's getting lonesome. She's feeling desolate being here all by herself. Can you send some more nurses to us? And so finally, after a few years, more nurses started coming to Mare Island. And the history, of course, after that is that the nurses have served marvelously and nobly at this naval hospital as well. But Martha Pringle was the first. Now, emergency construction. During World War I, these ward buildings were put up. Now, you say the World War I was in the Atlantic. Why do you need big hospital wards out here in California? I've never been able to find the answer to that. I'm guessing that it was a bureaucratic function. We've got money to build ward buildings. Let's put some on Mare Island. It turns out, of course, little did anybody know, these were being built in, it looks like August of 1918. Little did we know that the flu would come to California soon thereafter. Now the flu, as far as the Navy is concerned, the 1918 flu started on the East Coast near Boston, but then it spread centrifugally across the country, going in waves across the country. And once it reached Great Lakes, the naval station at Great Lakes, the medical people there summarized their experience and sent it to a letter to the medical people in Mare Island saying, stand by, you're going to be getting the flu, and here's our experience. Of the total personnel, X percent will get the flu. Of those, X percent will get pneumonia and need to be hospitalized, and of those, X percent will die. And it turned out, so the local planners said, all right, well, it looks like given the number of people we have, we've got enough hospital beds for the pneumonia cases, but we're going to have to put up tents to take care of the ambulatory cases that don't have pneumonia. And you know what? Being hospitalized in a tent in November isn't terrible. I mean, it's chilly, but it's not frigid, and it's fresh air. And this is the way it was done. So the pneumonia patients went to the hospital. The sick patients went into these ward buildings and into the tents. We had no idea, they had no idea the cause. There had been episodes of influenza, so-called in the past, that had been caused by bacteria, Haemophilus influenzae as an example. And so and actually the only virus that had been described at that point was the tobacco mosaic virus, which is by virus standards a huge virus and not infective of people. But they went about it treating it, or at least trying to prevent it, doing the best they had. In this case, they're spraying the sailors' throats with carbolic acid, phenol solution. This young medical officer was one of two who died of the flu on Mare Island. Two nurses, to my knowledge, died also, one of whom is buried at the Naval Cemetery on Mare Island. It was a terrible experience. They described these patients, and they were all young patients. They would come in feeling poorly in the morning and be dead by afternoon. So, and there was a terrible onslaught. I mean, they were inundated with patients as the caseload rose, and then as the caseload dropped toward the end of December. As a morale builder, the CO said, "Well, I'm going to have a Christmas decorating contest," and he sent people out to get decorations. And these are some of the pictures of the decorations. I love them for two reasons. One, just it gives you an idea of the attempt for some festivity, but also it gives you a pretty good view of what it looks like to be in a naval hospital in 1918. Now, the photographer was the hospital commander by the name of Fahrenholt, and he was an interesting guy. We often talk about, before I get into Fahrenholt, I have to talk to you about this. This is the nurses' residence. We finally got a nurses' residence. Again, the hospital commander writes back to the bureau saying, our nurses have to live in town. And in the summer, when it's dry and dusty and the roads are dusty, they get their white uniforms dusty and dirty. In the winter, when it's wet and rainy, they get their white uniforms messed up with mud. We need a proper facility for the nurses on the hospital grounds. This finally was built in 1918. I like this picture, the band shell. Farragut was an amateur photographer. I like this night shot. This is the nurses' quarters in the background, and the band shell here. Just a beautiful shot. Farragut was another one. Okay, more medicine, more science in medicine. This is a lab building. You have to have a separate lab building, I guess, to represent the fact that we're doing laboratory medicine now. Or maybe there was just no room in the main hospital building. Any ideas what this is? The hint is right here. This is a cutting bar. This is a power lawnmower around 1920. Farragut took a picture. Farragut took pictures of lots of different things. Now, Farragut was an interesting guy, and this represents to me the dual nature of medical officers. Doctors in the military are officers, presumably representing the interest of the military service, but they're also doctors, and they presumably represent the interest of their patients as well. I would argue that Farragut did things for his patients with abandon. Here are a couple of pools that were just placed on the grounds to provide a soft and serene setting that would promote healing. I was giving this talk a few years ago to the students at Touro, and they said, you know what? That pool is out behind the hospital. They just found it. They were cleaning up the area and restoring the grounds to something like what it looked like in the 1930s, and this pool is still there. The features, the lights on the ends, and the fountain is gone, but the pool is still there, dated 1917. He also thought that we should entertain the patients, and also boxing was considered to be a healthy American sport that guys could be involved with. He also had a theater group that he took to San Francisco to put on shows in the theaters of San Francisco until the Bureau wrote him a letter saying, we don't think that's such a good idea. One of my themes is innovation on Mare Island. Mare Island has the advantage of having a shipyard. And so one of the things that could be done was we built ambulance boats. They're built actually on the hull of a harbor tug, but they're fitted out very nicely with beds and actually a small galley. And if you remember, the San Francisco Bay didn't have bridges at the time. Going by water was about the only way you could bring somebody from San Francisco to Mare Island or Treasure Island or whatever. And so this ambulance boat was busy and had an active life until about 1936. Two others were built at Mare Island. They were sent to Norfolk, Virginia, and they're lost to history. Innovation on Mare Island. Another aspect of the science of medicine being represented by construction is the Alienist Hospital, built in 1920, I think it says. Alienist was the term then, the term of art for psychiatry. And this Alienist Hospital was built with all the latest innovations in psychiatric care. They were careful to put screens, heavy screens on the windows, because we didn't want depressed patients to commit suicide by defenestration, by ejecting themselves from windows. The Latin word for window is fenestra. They also had sunrooms where people could relax and be serene and quiet down. And so the Alienist Hospital represented another advance in medicine. Now, from the first construction of the wooden building, the COs of the hospital worried about fire. And every year they wrote back saying, if we're going to take care of patients, we need to have fireproof construction. That finally came in 1926. This is a ward structure for enlisted people. This is a ward structure for, probably not wards, for officers. This is the sick officers' quarters. The Navy has a tradition of not mixing enlisted people and officers. So the sick officers get their separate space. The enlisted are here. This went up in 1926, I think. And so now we now have fireproof construction. This is the beginning of the end of the Naval Hospital at Mare Island, November 1941. Now, the new Surgeon General, Ross McIntyre, who had been FDR's ENT doc, he was a Navy physician who had been introduced when Roosevelt was an assistant secretary of the Navy, he liked McIntyre a lot and actually deep selected him to become the Surgeon General of the Navy. Roosevelt knew that war was coming, and he knew he wanted to have good people in positions of leadership, and he picked McIntyre for that. McIntyre oversaw, he was an administrative genius. He oversaw the growth of the medical department in the Navy from pre-war, when they had something like 800 physicians to more than 19,000. He oversaw the growth of hospitals from 19, but one hospital we could not use the hospital in Canyacao, the Philippines, because it had been overtaken by the Japanese. So we started with 8 hospitals. By the end of the war, we had 99. So he was an administrative genius. He also saw the limitations that Mare Island Naval Hospital had. It was old, it was small, it could not be expanded, and on top of, because there was a hill that went up behind it, and the industrial plant of the Mare Island Naval Shipyard was in front of it, and on top of that, there was the worry that bombing was not all that accurate back in the day, and that if the Japanese ever attacked the industrial plant in Mare Island, that the hospital would be vulnerable too. So he set the 12th Naval District surgeon, the doctor who was in charge of the 12th Naval District medical aspects, he set him to work looking for sites for a potential new naval hospital. And this is part of that surgeon's report. It's a shell roadmap. We didn't have PowerPoint in those days. So he simply got a free roadmap from the local shell station and marked the locations. Now this is Alameda Island. This is a naval air base. This is where the evacuees from the Pacific Theater of War would be brought for medical care, either by air or by ship. And here are a few potential sites that he marked down here in the South Bay, up here in the Oakland Hills. It turns out that this was a defunct country club. McIntyre did this a lot. It was a defunct country club that the Navy was able to purchase for a song and use its facilities as a hospital until a proper hospital could be bought. It was the Oak Knoll Country Club, and hence the Naval Hospital Oakland always carried the name Oak Knoll when it was finally constructed. War comes. The Pearl Harbor attack on 7 December, the first patients, 179 of them, arrived at Mare Island on Christmas Day. And these were the sickest of the sick. A lot of them were burned patients, severely burned patients, a lot of fractures, a lot of sick patients. Now, I remember when I was in residency, if we had 5 admissions in a night, we complained like crazy. Can you imagine an onslaught of 179 really sick people all at one time? And you know what? By that time, the house had been staffed up with reservists and active duty folks, and they did just fine. In fact, there was correspondence that went back to the Bureau saying, well, we didn't know how the reservists would turn out, but you know what? They're doing a fabulous job. One of the reservists actually brought this innovative burn care development to Mare Island. The traditional care of burns was to paint it with a tea made of tree bark. And you would paint it on the wound and it would form like a fake, a false scab over the top. And then if you wanted to look at the thing, you had to peel that scab off. And it hurt like hell. Well, I think it was a dermatologist he was a reservist from Utah, came out and suggested the idea of using wax, Vaseline, cod liver oil, and sulfa, which is an antibiotic, put it in a flit gun. This is a gun that you use for spraying bug spray. You put the liquid in the canister, you pump the pump, and it blows the stuff out the front. You put this in and you spray it on the burns. This is a very poor quality picture, but here's a corpsman spraying a burn patient using a flit gun, and I think this is a big old smile on this guy's face. It provided instant relief of pain. It left the burns undamaged so they could be easily observed and maintained. Now, I mentioned that we had a psychiatric hospital. Well, between the wars, now combat fatigue, or what we call PTSD, has been known really since ancient Greek times. There's actually a Greek play called Ajax, which is about the number two sailor number two soldier in Athens, and he basically goes berserk at some point. And when you read the play, the descriptions are virtually identical to the descriptions that you see of people who have PTSD. In the Civil War, it was called a soldier's heart syndrome. In World War I, it was called combat neurosis or combat fatigue. We still called it combat fatigue in World War II. We didn't really have a proper name or a proper understanding of it until after the Vietnam War. Between the wars, the psychiatric community thought they had figured it out. They thought that they could do tests to screen out the people who would be susceptible to combat fatigue, and they would be sent off to be hospital workers in the States or do other social work. They would not be drafted into the service. Well, it turns out just about as soon as you send people to war, you're going to have psychiatric casualties. And one of the descriptions of what it was like to be fighting in the Pacific, one of the best descriptions, is in a book by Sir Max Hastings, a British historian. It's a 1-volume history of World War II, in which he describes the Australians fighting in New Guinea. It's hot, it's humid, it's buggy, the food is terrible, your clothing is rotting off your body, you're fighting up against a tough enemy up the hills, then he counterattacks, you're going back down the hills, you're in misery, there's no comfort, and everybody has a breaking point. So very quickly after we were involved in the Pacific Theater War, that little psychiatric hospital, which had single beds on 8-foot centers, changed to triple beds on 4-foot centers, was still overloaded. And so the Navy leased from the psychiatric hospital, the California Psychiatric Hospital in Napa, California, this brand new ward that they had built to be a TB sanitarium. We leased that for the war. And this is actually where our war psychotics were sent, the ones who were the most severely mentally ill. It became known as the Imola Annex to the Naval Hospital. Mare Island had lots of visitors. Among them is Mrs. Roosevelt. There are 2 stories in this picture as far as I'm concerned. Look at the nurses. They're delighted. They're leaning in, they're smiling, they're happy. Look at the commanding officer of the hospital. I'll bet you he's a Republican. He's not real happy. I think his attitude is, I've got more important things to be doing than what I'm doing here. Bob Hope in the circle was here. This is outdoors between the ward buildings. You can see even guys on gurneys. This looked to me like an army band, so it must maybe a mutual group, people listening from the windows. Lots and lots of visitors came to Mare Island. Finally, Mare Island was designated as the amputee center for the Pacific Theater of War. And I think this was a propitious thing. 2 things about being on a Navy yard, I think, contributed to this. One was you had machinists, skilled machinists who could machine these intricate artificial joints, and you had access to modern materials, plastics. An Army orthopedist from Letterman wrote back to his bureau, I looked at the Navy operation the other day, and you know what? They're making vastly better prostheses than we do at 1/3 the cost. Go Navy. It was busy, design capacity 600, reached 2,300. Most of these were recuperating. They weren't all acutely ill like we see in hospitals nowadays. They had to be put somewhere until they could either go back to the fleet or be discharged from the Navy. After the war, there was a rapid demobilization. People wanted to get home, to be close to home. The policy was also, we're going to have a permanent hospital somewhere in the Bay Area, Oak Knoll. The bed capacity went down to 1,000 in 1946. Then it was announced that they wanted to close the hospital. The CO warned that Vallejo, which incidentally had a very good lobbying operation, was going to fight the closure as a mother tiger defending its young to retain the hospital. In 1956, the bed capacity was down some more, down to 50 beds. In June, it went back up to 200 for influenza admissions in 57. But finally, in October of 1957, word was out that the hospital was closed. This is the hospital at its peak. This is the last Navy construction in World War II, called the Owen Building. We'll see that again in a minute, thanks to Touro University. Here's the sick officers. This is the ward building. Another one was built here toward the end of the Depression. This is H1. Whole bunch of outbuildings over here. Busy place, nurses' quarters in a Y shape. I'll talk about that in a second. So the past is prologue. Here's this nurse Waves Barracks being built in 1943. It's now an administrative building for Touro University. This is the Owen building in construction. It was a recreational facility. It has a swimming pool, a basketball court. It is now the main instructional space at Touro University called Lander Hall. And finally, this structure, which was a Y-shaped nurses' residence built for the comfort of the nurses, and Y-shape being unusual. Most Navy construction is square or rectangular, but a lovely sort of Spanish revival structure now is the main administrative building at Touro University. And that ends the story that I have to tell you. Any questions?